We've talked about the restrictions a more or less Kantian theory would put on going to war. Now I want to talk about what a Kantian theory would say about what is morally acceptable to do in war. And, I think a Kantian theory would actually just back up something very much like the traditional rules of war we've talked about. How and why will take a little bit of explanation, though, right? Because, you might think it's like, well, look, if you go to war, if you send people to die, if you kill other people, isn't that using others as a mere means? How is it consistent with, respecting someone as an end in themselves to use violence against them, maybe even kill them, right? We've already talked about self-defense, and that really is what rests at the basis of this. But I think Nagel gives us a deeper way to think about this. And, A gives us kind of a framework to think about what Kantians would say about war, how you can support the traditional rules of war with a Kantian theory. But I also think he raises some really interesting and, quite honestly, disturbing points about the relationship between Kantianism and utilitarianism in our moral thinking. So I want to talk about all that. But the first thing I want to talk about is this fighting clean versus fighting dirty distinction. And this is kind of at the foundation of what Nagel says about what it's acceptable to do in war. He thinks this distinction, when you put it with a Kantian theory, or as he calls it, an absolutist theory, but I think Nagel's absolutism, as I've said, is just Kantianism. When you put this distinction with an absolutist or Kantian theory, you get a pretty good explanation of the traditional rules of war, why we should obey them, why they're morally important. Utilitarianism, like everything, will treat these rules as rules of thumb, generally don't break them because it has bad consequences, but they don't have any moral importance in and of themselves. Nagel thinks a Kantian approach can explain why they have importance in and of themselves. So the first part of this is that Nagel thinks that certain hostile relationships are compatible with respecting other persons, or in more Kantian language, which Nagel doesn't quite use, but I think he has kind of in the background, treating them as ends in themselves. But for this to be true, the hostile relationships must follow certain rules. And he thinks we can see both of these things, that hostile relationships are compatible with treating others as ends in themselves, and that they need to follow certain rules. If we think about the ordinary distinction we draw between fighting clean and fighting dirty. Nagel gives us a couple ordinary cases that are pretty far away from the ethics of war, right? He says, well, look, let's take one, right? Let's say you're having an argument with a cab driver, right? He wrote this in the 70s, Fill in another example. I know cab drivers. Nagel might be. Imagine you're having an argument with your friendly neighborhood blacksmith, right? But the idea is the cabbie is trying to cheat you over a fare. Well, what is it acceptable to say to him or do, and what is it not? And you can make this any business relationship, right? Somebody who built a deck on your house, or made you a birthday cake, or cut your yard, or whatever, right? You might say, look, you can call the person a cheat. Other relationships, like let's say they built a deck or made a cake, you can call them incompetent, you can call them stupid, you can say they don't know how to bake. All of that seems fair, right? But let's say you insult the person on the basis of their race or religion or their looks, right? Now, some of this probably already just says bad things about you and your character, but it also seems like you've wronged him, right? If you start making fun of the way the guy looks, if he has a facial scar or something and you start making fun of it, that seems to have gone too far, right? Why is it you can call him a cheat, you can call him a liar, you can say he doesn't know how to do his job, you can threaten to sue him, All of that seems fair. But making fun of his appearance doesn't. Or think about this, right? Imagine, we take the cab driver case. Imagine he has a picture of his wife and kids on the dash. It seems like it would be crossing some kind of line to insult his children or his wife, right? Why is that? Or you can think of political campaigns, right? In the same way, look, you can call your opponent a liar. You can call him a cheat. You can call him or her a communist. You can call him or her a Nazi or imply that they're a Nazi. These are all very bad things, right? But in a lot of cases, they don't seem unfair, right? They might not be nice. They might not be true, but they don't seem to cross a line. But if you attack someone's family, someone's family who's not involved, in the race, in their father or mother or whoever's politics, then that seems unfair, right? There are borderline cases, Trump's children, their allegations that they were enriched by their relationship with him. There are the same allegations for Hunter Biden. I'm tempted to think both are true. If that is true, then that is relevant to the candidate. That's a special case, right? But if their wife or children have absolutely nothing to do with their politics, that's just crossing a line, right? Jimmy Carter, when he was president, his daughter was 12 years old. You can't insult Amy Carter, right? She's not making political decisions. She's not profiting from the presidency. That's just mean. That's just crossing a line. You can say that Jimmy Carter is the worst president in American history. You can say he's incompetent, so on and so forth. That all seems fair. But saying his daughter is weird looking seems like it crosses a boundary. Why is that? Other things with politics, you can't let the air out of like the campaign bus's tires, right? Things like that. Why is that fighting? Why is that off the table? Nagel would say in all of those cases, we're fighting dirty. Nagel has this distinction between fighting clean and fighting dirty. And he thinks, when we think about these cases, we already kind of have the distinction in mind. He'll say, look, you fight clean when the aggression is directed only at the persons directly involved in the conflict and only at features of them relevant to the conflict. Whether the taxi driver is a cheat is very relevant to your argument with him over whether he's charged you a fare, right? Whether the guy who builds your deck or bakes a cake for your kid's birthday is competent is very much relevant to the dispute you're having over whether you should pay them, whether they did a good enough job to deserve the money, right? How they look, what their race is, what their religion is, how tall they are, all of those things are irrelevant to the conflict you are having. That is fighting dirty. What's more important in fighting dirty, or maybe even more important, is when you insult the person's wife or the politician's like school-age child, you are dragging in people who aren't involved in the conflict. So Nagel says to fight clean, the aggression must be directed only at people who are directly involved in the conflict with you. You can't insult the taxi driver's wife and then say, well, she makes him breakfast and coffee every morning that gives him energy to go out and cheat people. No, that is not direct enough involvement. It must be targeted at features that are relevant to the conflict. Whether they are fit for office if they're a politician, whether they have cheated you if they're a business person, right? You fight dirty whenever you direct your aggression at people not involved in the conflict, maybe because they're easy targets, or features of the person involved in the conflict that aren't relevant to the fight you're having, also because that might be an easy target, right? Well, Nagel says this fighting clean, fighting dirty distinction is relevant in war, and he thinks it makes sense of a lot of the distinctions, a lot of the rules of war, right? If you attack civilians, you are attacking people not directly involved in the hostile relationship. Enemy soldiers are a threat. They are directly involved in the hostile relationship. They are open to be targeted. And Nagel is very clear on this. It's like, it's the fact that they're a threat. It's the fact that they're involved in this hostile relationship that makes them a legitimate target. It's not anything morally wrong they have done. You know, there might be draftees in World War II who were, social democrats. That was one of the main opposition parties to the Nazis. They might be social democrats. They might hate Hitler's guts. They might want him to die. But if they're out there on a beach with a gun, they are involved in the hostile relationship. They are a legitimate target. There might be civilians who are truly evil people who will go to hell if it exists, who are not involved in the hostile relationship. They are not legitimate targets. They might be much more evil than a soldier it is justified to kill. The 50-year-old fanatical Nazi baker in Bavaria can't be killed, even though he is a horrible, horrible, horrible human being, right? It is the involvement in the hostile relationship, not their moral goodness or badness, that justifies this. POWs and detainees must be treated decently. Well, why? Once somebody has surrendered, they are no longer involved in a hostile relationship. For the purposes of Kantian moral theory, they are a person deserving of respect. Doing anything to them after they're no longer involved in the hostile relationship is treating someone as a mere means. It's wrong. Attacking civilians because they're an easy target is wrong, right? Decent treatment of the injured and sick, same principle, right? If someone's sick, too sick to fight or too injured to fight, they're no longer a threat. They deserve respect under Kantian moral theory just the same as anybody else. No use of mala inze weapons. Part of this just is they don't discriminate. They kill civilians indiscriminately. But Nagel thinks that, given the way that some weapons kill people, they go over the top and attack the soldiers as human beings and not just as soldiers, right? He talks about weapons that have a tendency to leave people maimed or disfigured after the war, right? Like fire, as he thinks, burning, as he thinks, something that probably goes above and beyond this. Gas, nuclear. So he thinks Malinze weapons, it's partially a large purpose, they just don't discriminate, but he thinks that they go far enough, or at least some of them do. They target the soldiers as human beings, target features of them that aren't relevant to the conflict. So, and now look, there are borderline cases here, right? You could not burn all the farms of an enemy because they feed the soldiers, right? They also feed civilians. I think Nagel would go even further in saying just feeding somebody is not supporting them as a soldier, not supporting only those features relevant to the hostile relationship. That would be wrong. Could you bomb arms factories? I think you could. That is very much relevant to the hostile relationship. What about military members of the military involved in support and logistics? Might be some closer calls, but in a lot of cases, I think so. Medics would always be off the table. They are just ministering to the soldier's needs as a human being, not just as a soldier. That would make sense, Nagel says, of the don't target medics part of, the Geneva Conventions. That's part of the decent treatment of injured and sick, you can't target the other side's medics, right? So hopefully, guys understand Nagel's basic framework and also how he thinks it makes sense of the traditional rules of war. In the next lecture, I want to finish talking about Nagel. There's one more interesting feature of his essay that I think we really should discuss.